The 2025 Industrial Stormwater General Permit was released back in January, and we've now had enough time to meet with regulators, talk with permittees, and get a better understanding of what's in this new permit. So today's video, we're going to focus on new sampling changes and what that's going to look like on the field. We're actually going to dive into the permit and show you line for line where these new changes exist, help you better understand what you need to do to stay in compliance. So let's get into it. So first, I want to talk a little bit about some of the new sampling requirements. There's two new industry-specific sampling parameters. These are for PFAS and 6-ppd quinone. Again, these are industry-specific, meaning that they only pertain to certain facilities. That's based on your NAICS code in Table 3, and we'll show what that looks like here in a minute. So for PFAS, these are for facilities with a waste management and remediation service NAICS. That's a NAICS code that begins with 562. And also, certain air transportation facilities that have a NAICS code beginning with 481. The air transportation facilities need to have current or historic use of the aqueous film-forming foam. This is the firefighting foam you see in the picture here. That's known to contain PFAS. Facilities that don't have that foam will need to just mark that on their discharge monitoring. Let's talk a little bit about PFAS. PFAS is an acronym that stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. This is an umbrella term that encompasses a group of thousands of chemicals. You may hear about these on the news, read about them in news articles, often referred to as forever chemicals. They call them forever chemicals because they're extremely environmentally persistent. They're hard to get rid of. They're actually easily transported through groundwater and into our drinking water and can cause all kinds of human health and environmental health issues. For this permit, for the ISGP, we are only required to sample and report on 6 of these compounds. It's these 6 listed right here. The sampling method for PFAS actually can analyze for about 40 of these. So what certain facilities have indicated that they're going to do, what they've told me they're going to do, is they're going to make sure on their COC and in their discussions with their lab, they're going to make sure that they're only getting reports on these 6 to kind of limit some of their liability. Another interesting note about PFAS is the PFAS sampling. If you're a facility that has to sample for PFAS, you now also need to sample any discharges to ground that you have. So we'll talk a little bit about this, but first I want to kind of show you where all this is in the permit. So here we are in the 2025 ISGP, and I want to just search for PFAS and talk about this. So the first thing I want to mention is discharges to ground. So you'll know in this permit that typically facilities that have discharges to ground are not required to sample those on-site discharges to ground. However, in this new permit in 2025, they've added some caveats to that, and one of those is unless the facility is subject to PFAS sampling per condition S5B. So where do we find where those sampling requirements are? So if we look here in Table 3, we can see our additional benchmarks and sampling requirements. And if we search through here for PFAS, we'll see air transportation, again, those NAICS codes with 481. And we'll also see waste management and remediation services. That is with a 562 NAICS code. And here are those 6 PFAS parameters that we need to sample for. So I also want to point out here that it's only the air transportation facilities with known, current, or historical use of aqueous film-forming foam, this AFFF, that are subject to the PFAS sampling requirements. It also says that facilities with no known, current, or historical AFFF will need to just indicate that on their DMR and don't need to. So I want to talk about our next sampling parameter, and that is 6-ppdQ or 6-ppd quinone. This is a tire-derived chemical that has been shown to be acutely toxic to coho salmon. The recent discovery and is a pretty big deal here in Washington State. This sampling requirement is again industry specific, so only pertains to waste management facilities that have a NAICS code that begins with 562. Transportation facilities, that's all transportation facilities that require permit coverage, as well as hazardous waste facilities. Interestingly, this new 6-ppdQ sampling requirement doesn't begin until 2028. This is because it is such a new discovery that they're giving a little bit of time for labs to get accredited, and hopefully bring some of the cost of analysis down. Small businesses are also getting a little bit of reprieve from this sampling requirement. Businesses with less than 50 employees company-wide only need to sample for 6 ppdq annually. Let's jump into the permit real quick and just kind of see where all this lives. So here we are in the permit. Again, I just want to point out the 6 ppd quinone, 6 ppdq sampling requirement in Table 3 goes into effect on January 1st, 2028. Again, we'll look in Table 3. Remember, Table 3 is where we can tell what specific industries have to sample for what. So again, we see transportation facilities. This includes railroad transportation, transit and ground passenger transportation, truck transportation, postal service, water transportation, air transportation, petroleum bulk stations and terminals, and warehouse and storage facilities. We also have hazardous waste treatment, storage and disposal facilities, and dangerous waste recyclers subject to provisions of RCRA Subtitle C. Again, we come down here and see our 6 ppdq sampling requirement. And then again, waste management and remediation services that begin with a 562, including but not limited to landfills, transfer stations, open dumps, and land application sites, except as described in S1C6, C7, or again, here is our 6 ppdq sampling requirement. So again, back up here, we also see that small businesses subject to the 6 ppdq sampling may sample once per year rather than quarterly. So just for definition's sake, the definition of small business in the permit means any business entity, including a sole proprietorship, corporation, partnership, or other legal entity that is owned and operated independently from all other businesses and has 50 or fewer employees. So this 50 or fewer employees, company-wide, you only need to sample 6 ppdq one time a year. One important note for both the PFAS and the 6 ppdq is that both of these are report only. Report only means that they're not subject to benchmarks. They are really more of a data collection exercise from ecology. They want to look at these parameters. They want to look to see, does this need to go into the 2030 permit? Is this a problem on industrial facilities? What types of benchmarks would make sense? And that type of thing. So while you do have to sample for these, you do have to report the numbers to ecology, pay for that analysis and that type of thing. You're not subject to benchmarks and effluent limits for these compounds. So I've opened up the red line version of the permit here to showcase one last change to our sampling requirements, and that's in regard to how pH samples need to be taken. Previously, under the previous permits, we were allowed to use pH paper or pH strips. That's no longer allowed. They've struck that from the permit, and now everyone has to use a calibrated pH meter. So if you're using a pH paper, pH strips, know you need to go out and buy yourself a meter. You need to buy some calibration standards. And when you're looking for that meter, you want to make sure that you have a resolution of 0.1 standard unit. So I want to stay in the red line version of the permit for a second and talk a little bit about lab documentation. Your lab documentation, this is everything that needs to go into your lab reports. This is what your lab is sending to you, including your sample results, but also, the conditions of the lab, who took the analysis, what the analytical methods were, and that type of thing. So there's two new requirements for your lab documentation that you need to have on site and made available to ecology, and could be useful for you to review for instances where you have a benchmark exceedance or some funky data coming in. So those new requirements include a chain of custody form, which you should be doing anyway, but you now need to keep that, as well as a case narrative. There was some question during the draft process of kind of what is a case narrative. So it actually has been defined in the final release of the permit, and we'll just read it. So a case narrative means the narrative provided in the laboratory report describing the condition of the samples upon lab receipt, how they were stored to the laboratory, any issues with analysis, and related QA, QC issues that may affect data integrity or usability. So make sure when you talk with your lab, make sure this is something that they include in their normal lab documentation that they send. While we're here in the red line version of the permit, I want to move on to Table 6 and talk about effluent limits These are for sites that discharge to 303D listed water. So if your site discharges to an impaired water body, you may have a numeric effluent limit as opposed to a benchmark. We're really going to focus on discharges to marine waters. This is where the biggest changes here have occurred. And this is for copper, lead, zinc, and pentachlorophenol. These values have now been added to the table. They were previously a site-specific calculation. So know that if you discharge to a marine water and you have to sample for one of these and have numeric effluent limits, that those values may have changed. Also in this, we have added arsenic and 6 ppdq. Arsenic has a value for freshwater of 0.018 micrograms per liter and 0.14 micrograms per liter, depending on if you're in freshwater or marine water, and 6 ppdq is report only. So check out Table 6 if you have questions about your numeric effluent limit. We also have a new sample point waiver request process in the 2025 permit. This is a process that facilities that have a sample point that is unfeasible to sample from, it's unsafe to sample from, can go through to either move that sampling point or get a waiver from that sampling point. So what this process looks like is a permittee is going to do a modification of permit coverage. They're going to do a detailed explanation of why it's making the waiver request. It's going to talk a little bit about the BMPs implemented in these areas that drain to that sample point. And then through that modification of coverage, ecology will either approve or deny the request through an administrative order. And they have within 60 days to kind of make that determination. So one thing to note is that a modification of permit coverage also requires public notice, and that in the meantime, while you're waiting on the results of this, you need to still be sampling those sample requirements. So it's important if you need to go through this process to get that done quickly, so you're not putting someone in danger or missing sampling opportunity. So that's the bulk of the new sampling requirements found in the permit. There's a few other nuancy things regarding discharges to ground and some other minor changes that we didn't go over. I encourage you to read the permit, look at ecology's resources, and look at some of the resources the Stormwater Center have put out regarding the new permit to learn about some of those other changes. But for now, I want to transition and talk about some common questions that have come up regarding new sampling requirements. So first, I want to promote the Q&A sheet that we put out a few weeks back. This is common questions that were sent to us either through email or through discussions, webinars, that type of thing. We compiled all of those questions, sent those off to Ecology, and Ecology has sent us responses, and that's what these responses are here. We go in kind of topic by topic and cover a number of questions. I think there's like 65 on this document. I want to go through these questions one by one. I'm not going to cover everything that's in that Q&A sheet, so I encourage you to go read that. We'll link to that in the description as well. But the first question here is, do I sample for PFAS in Q1 of 2025, or do I have time to plan like I do with updating the SWIP? So we didn't cover the SWIP update, but in the permit, there is a little bit of extra time given to permittees to update those SWIP and make those changes on their site. However, as Ecology has indicated, that doesn't apply to sampling. So if your facility is required to sample for PFAS, they should be sampling for PFAS in Q1 of 2025. The next question, do case narratives regarding the sample handling and storage need to be included in lab reports in Q1? So remember, we went over those case narratives as a new lab documentation item that needs to be included. And yes, you should have those case narratives for your Q1 sampling. The case narrative does not need to be included with your discharge monitoring report or DMR, but should be available with other lab documents on site. So the third question here is, does Ecology have any guidance for sampling the new sampling parameters or for sampling discharges to ground? And Ecology indicated that they are updating their ISGP sampling guidance. I think the last time this was updated was about 10 years ago. So we are due for an update, but it's supposed to cover a lot of these new sampling items, including discharges to ground and the new sample parameters. The fourth question, where can I find a lab to take new sample parameters for testing? Are there labs in Washington? Ecology has a lab search tool, and you can search by method 1633 to see which labs analyze PFAS. Yes, there are labs in Washington that will analyze your PFAS, and you can also send labs out of state. Question 5, are all sampling requirements, whether new or old, found on your SAW account or discharge monitoring reports current? Question 5, are all sampling requirements, whether new or old, found on our SAW account or discharge monitoring report portals current? Ecology indicated that those should be current, but they have caught an error here or there, so reach out to your local permit administrator if you believe there is an error. So question 6 is, do facilities that have to sample discharge to ground due to PFAS sampling requirements need to sample all parameters for their facility or just PFAS at those locations? So remember, only certain facilities have to sample for PFAS, that is air transportation, as well as waste management and remediation. Those facilities will also have to sample their discharges to ground, but it's just for PFAS, not for all of their sampling requirements. They'll have to do those other sampling requirements at their normal discharge points, but just PFAS at their discharges to. And question 7 is, when sampling a discharge to ground from an infiltration BMP, where should I take my sample? So remember, only certain facilities are going to have to sample discharges to ground due to PFAS. Those facilities may be implementing infiltration BMPs and want to get the full benefit of that BMP. So the kind of question here is whether or not they can take the sample before the BMP or need to take it after the BMP and what that looks like. So ecology has indicated kind of either way. You may sample before the water enters the BMP, or you could install and sample from a sampling well. So that's a general overview of the new sampling requirements found in the 2025 Industrial Stormwater General Permit. We're going to continue this series and go topic by topic through the new permit so you're aware of all the new changes you need to know about. So please subscribe to our channel so you never miss a video.